The moment my father pointed across the trustees' conference table and said, "She's only here because she wants my money," I realized this meeting had never been about an inheritance. Why had the trustee gone silent instead of correcting him? Why was a thick financial report sitting unopened in front of her? And why did my older brother suddenly refuse to meet my eyes? My father wanted everyone to believe I was waiting for him to die. What none of us knew yet was that the trust everyone was fighting over had been hiding a secret far more dangerous than any family feud. Then Trustee Margaret Collins rested her hand on the sealed report and quietly said, "Before we discuss who gets what, you all deserve to know what this family actually owes. If you've ever watched a family argument spiral because of money, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country and your local time in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if stories about truth, family, and quiet justice are your kind of journey, consider subscribing so you won't miss what happened after that report was finally opened." 3 months before that meeting, I had no idea my father had already begun putting me on trial. If anyone had asked me to describe my relationship with Richard Simmons, I would have said it was distant but predictable. We weren't close. We hadn't been for years. But I also didn't think he hated me. I was 38 years old, lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, and owned a small accounting and financial consulting practice. Most of my clients were family-owned businesses that had grown faster than their bookkeeping systems. I spent my days untangling cash flow problems, helping owners negotiate with lenders, and explaining financial statements in plain English. Ironically, the one family business I never touched was my own. Simmons Construction Group had been my father's life since before I was born. He built it from a 2-truck operation into one of the better-known commercial contractors in the region. Growing up, I admired what he had accomplished. I also learned very early that there was room for only one hero in his story. My older brother Ethan had started working at the company straight out of college. Dad introduced him to everyone as the future of Simmons Construction. When people asked about me, Dad usually smiled politely. "Kaylee's good with numbers." That was all. No mention that I had become a CPA, no mention that I had earned certifications in business valuation and restructuring. No mention that banks' attorneys and business owners trusted me with decisions involving millions of dollars. Just, "She's good with numbers." For a long time, I convinced myself that was enough. Then life became busy. I married, divorced 5 years later, started my own firm, bought a modest townhouse, built a life that belonged entirely to me. Family gatherings became holidays instead of weekly dinners. I honestly thought everyone preferred it that way. The first sign something had changed came during my cousin Melissa's birthday barbecue. As soon as I walked into the backyard, conversation stopped. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Several relatives smiled too quickly. One aunt hugged me longer than usual. Another patted my arm with the kind of sympathy people reserve for someone recovering from bad news. I couldn't understand it. Then my Aunt Linda leaned toward me while everyone was filling their plates. "I heard things have been difficult between you and your dad." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She looked surprised. "Oh, I assumed you'd talked." "Talked about what?" She hesitated. "Never mind." "No, seriously." She lowered her voice. "Richard told us you've suddenly become very interested in his estate." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded ridiculous. "My what?" "His estate." "I've never asked him about his estate." She frowned. "He said you've been calling more often lately." "I've called him twice this year." She looked genuinely confused. "That's not what he told everyone." For the rest of the afternoon, little comments began connecting like puzzle pieces. "So, have you two worked things out?" "I hope everything stays peaceful." "Money tears families apart." every sentence carried the same hidden assumption that I was fighting my father over his wealth. Except I wasn't. I drove home replaying every conversation in my head. There had to be some misunderstanding. Dad had always cared about appearances. Maybe he'd exaggerated something. Maybe someone misunderstood him. Maybe I still wanted to believe the best. The following Sunday, I called him. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad. Kaylee." His voice was unusually flat. "I wanted to ask you something." "What is it?" "Have you been telling people I'm after your money?" Silence. Not shocked silence. Thinking silence. Then he chuckled. "I guess people like to gossip." "I didn't ask about people." Another pause. "I've simply told the truth." "The truth? You've suddenly become interested in family matters after staying away for years." "I've been working." "So has Ethan." "I never left because of work. I left because you made it clear Ethan belonged there." His tone hardened. "You always think you're the victim." "I'm asking one question, and I'm giving you an answer." "No, you're avoiding it." "I won't argue." He hung up. I stared at my phone. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes, yet somehow I felt smaller than when it began. That evening, my mother called. Patricia almost never phoned without a reason. "Sweetheart?" "Hi, Mom." "Your father is under a lot of pressure." "I know. Maybe you should stop asking about money." I closed my eyes. "I never asked about money." "He feels attacked." "I asked why he's telling people I want his estate." She sighed. "You know how sensitive he is." That sentence summarized my childhood better than anything else. Your father is tired. Your father is stressed. Your father didn't mean it. Your father is proud. Your father is sensitive. No matter what happened, everything somehow became everyone else's responsibility. I don't think protecting his feelings should require sacrificing my reputation. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked quietly, "Can't you just let this go?" I looked around my empty living room. For years, I had let things go, being overlooked, being compared, watching Ethan receive opportunities I was never offered, listening to Dad praise everyone except me. But this felt different. This wasn't about old disappointments. This was about my integrity. As a CPA, trust was everything. People hired me because they believed my judgment. If stories like this reached clients, the damage wouldn't stay inside the family. 2 weeks later, I discovered just how far my father's version of events had traveled. One of my longtime clients invited me to a charity dinner. The event was full of business owners, attorneys, bankers, and community leaders. Halfway through dinner, an older developer I'd known professionally for years leaned toward me. "I hope things work out with your dad." My stomach tightened. "I'm sorry." "He told someone at the Rotary luncheon you've been pushing him about his assets." I nearly dropped my fork. "The Rotary luncheon?" He nodded. He seemed heartbroken. I forced a smile. "I think you've been given inaccurate information." "I'm relieved to hear that." But I wasn't relieved. I was terrified. My father hadn't just complained to relatives. He'd taken the story into professional circles. Charlotte wasn't a huge city. Reputations traveled faster than facts. That night I couldn't sleep. Instead, I searched my own memory. Had I ever asked about his finances? No. Had I ever requested access to company records? Never. Had I ever questioned his will? Not once. The accusation had no foundation, which meant it served another purpose. The question was, 3 days later, my assistant knocked gently on my office door. "Kaylee?" "Yeah." "There was a certified letter delivered this morning." She handed me a cream-colored envelope. The return address immediately caught my attention. Collins Fiduciary Services. I had never heard from them before. Inside was a formal letter signed by Margaret Collins. It informed me that as a named beneficiary of the Simmons Family Trust, I was requested to attend a confidential meeting regarding matters affecting the administration of the trust. The language was precise, professional, almost unusually careful. One sentence stood out more than the rest. Your attendance is strongly recommended before any further beneficiary decisions are made. Not requested. Strongly recommended. I read that line 3 more times. Then I turned the page over. Attached behind the letter was a short handwritten note from Margaret herself. Miss Simmons, there are financial matters you deserve to understand before relying on information provided by any family member. I stared at those words for a long time. For the first time since the rumors began, someone wasn't asking me to defend myself. Someone was quietly suggesting that the story I'd been hearing and the story everyone else believed might not be the real one. I read Margaret Collins's handwritten note at least 6 times before I folded it back into the envelope. There are financial matters you deserve to understand before relying on information provided by any family member. Not your father, not your brother, not even the company. She had deliberately written any family member. As a CPA, I had learned to pay attention not only to what people said, but to what they carefully chose not to say. That single sentence told me 3 things. First, Margaret couldn't disclose everything in writing. Second, whatever she wanted to discuss involved legal duties. Third, she believed someone inside my family had not been truthful. I picked up the phone and called the number on the letter. Collins Fiduciary Services. Hi, my name is Kaylee Simmons. I received a certified letter asking me to attend a meeting. One moment, Ms. Simmons. A few seconds later, another voice came on. This is Margaret Collins. Her voice was calm and measured, the kind that immediately inspired confidence. Ms. Collins, thank you for calling me. Thank you for calling back. I wanted to ask whether this meeting is about my father's estate. There was a brief pause. It concerns the Simmons Family Trust. Is my father aware you've contacted me? Yes. So this isn't confidential from him? It is confidential in the sense that I cannot discuss trust matters over the phone. I understand. But yes, he knows beneficiaries are being contacted. Her wording was exact. Every sentence stayed carefully within legal boundaries. I'm trying to decide whether I need legal representation. You are always free to seek independent legal advice. You can't tell me whether I should. No. Another deliberate answer. What if I ask whether that's something you would generally recommend? I generally recommend that beneficiaries understand their rights before attending meetings involving trust administration. Not yes, not no, just enough information. I smiled despite myself. She was very good. So I'll see you next Tuesday. I look forward to meeting you. After we hung up, I canceled 2 client appointments. Something about this felt too important to postpone. For the rest of the afternoon, I reviewed everything I already knew about Simmons Family Trust, which embarrassingly wasn't much. I knew my grandparents had established it after selling several commercial properties decades earlier. I knew portions of the trust-owned investment real estate. I knew Dad often referred to it as the family's foundation. Beyond that, nothing. Growing up, money was never openly discussed. My father believed children should simply trust him. Questions were interpreted as disrespect. By Tuesday morning, I had convinced myself I was probably overthinking the situation. Maybe Margaret simply needed updated beneficiary information. Maybe the rumors had nothing to do with the trust. Maybe. The office occupied the top floor of a historic brick building overlooking downtown Charlotte. Unlike flashy law firms with marble lobbies and oversized logos, Collins Fiduciary Services looked understated. Dark wood, neutral colors, bookshelves lined with trust law treatises instead of marketing awards. Everything about the place suggested discretion rather than wealth. Margaret greeted me herself. She was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed with silver hair pulled neatly behind her head. She shook my hand firmly. "Miss Simmons, please call me Kaylee. If you'll call me Margaret." She led me into a conference room. No one else was there. Not my father, not Ethan, not attorneys. Just the two of us. A folder rested neatly in front of each chair. Mine remained closed. "I appreciate you coming." "I appreciate the invitation." Margaret folded her hands. "Before we discuss the trust itself, I need to explain my role." I nodded. "I am not your attorney." "I understand." "I am not your father's attorney either." That caught my attention. "My legal duty is owed to the trust and by extension to all beneficiaries equally." She watched to make sure I understood. "When interests conflict, I cannot favor one beneficiary over another." "So you don't work for my father?" "I work with your father." There was an important difference. My responsibility is to preserve trust assets according to the governing document and applicable law. She slid a copy of the trust agreement toward me. "I've never actually seen this." "I'm aware." I looked up. "You knew that?" Margaret nodded once. "According to our records, you were provided notice of the trust's existence years ago, but you never requested a full copy." "I didn't know I could. Many beneficiaries don't." I felt slightly embarrassed. As someone who regularly advised clients to ask questions before signing documents, I had never asked for the one document that directly affected my own future. She gave me time to skim the opening pages. The trust had been created by my grandparents 23 years earlier. Its stated purpose was straightforward: protect family assets, generate income, provide equal long-term benefits for both children and future grandchildren. Equal. The word appeared repeatedly. Equal treatment, equal consideration, equal fiduciary obligations. Nothing suggested Ethan was entitled to more simply because he worked for the company. Nothing suggested my years away somehow reduced my rights. I looked up. My father always implied Ethan would inherit responsibility because he stayed. Margaret answered carefully. Employment and beneficiary status are different legal concepts. So, the trust does not automatically reward employment. That alone overturned years of assumptions. She opened another folder. "I have a few questions." "Of course." "Have you been involved in Simmons Construction's financial management during the past 10 years? "No." "Have you authorized any loans on behalf of the company?" "No." "Have you guaranteed company debt?" "Absolutely not." She made notes. "Have you ever requested trust distributions beyond those permitted by the governing document?" "No." "Have you asked your father for early inheritance?" "Never." She looked at me over her glasses. "I expected those answers." "Then why ask?" "Because fiduciary records should reflect facts, not assumptions." I appreciated that. Facts. Not opinions. Not family narratives. Facts. Margaret closed her notebook. "I'd now like to ask about your professional background." I explained my CPA practice, corporate restructuring, cash flow analysis, debt negotiations, financial reporting. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked a question I hadn't anticipated. "If you reviewed financial statements and discovered recurring reporting delays, what would concern you first?" I answered automatically. "It depends." "On what?" "Whether the delays are administrative or whether someone benefits from delaying disclosure." She nodded slowly. "What if the delays happened repeatedly over several years?" I'd want to know what information wasn't reaching decision makers. Another note. What if secured debt increased significantly while reported asset values remained relatively stable? I frowned. I'd question liquidity. What else? I'd ask whether collateral had changed, and if collateral had changed without full explanation, I'd investigate immediately. Margaret leaned back slightly. It wasn't satisfaction on her face, more like confirmation. I thought you might say that. Something inside me tightened. This conversation wasn't theoretical. She was describing something real. She finally slid a thin stack of documents toward me. These are annual trustee summaries. They're public. They're available to beneficiaries. I began turning pages. Most of the information was routine. Investment performance, administrative expenses, tax filings. Then I noticed a pattern. 3 consecutive annual reports had almost identical wording in one section. Certain financial information remains pending due to delayed submissions from affiliated operating entities. The sentence repeated year after year, almost word for word. I looked up. What are affiliated operating entities? Margaret answered carefully. In this case, she paused. Simmons Construction Group. I looked back down. 3 years, then 4, then 5. Every report mentioned delayed financial submissions, no explanations, no details, just delays. As an accountant, repeated delays rarely meant paperwork. They usually meant someone was buying time. I turned another page. Near the bottom was a small footnote. Easy to miss. Certain trust-owned assets remain subject to lender documentation review. I stopped reading. Lender documentation. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "What does that phrase suggest to you professionally?" I stared at the sentence again. If lender documentation is being reviewed, I spoke slowly, thinking through each word, then either financing is being renewed. I looked at her. Or trust assets have been pledged as collateral. Margaret remained silent. Silence itself became an answer. I flipped through the remaining pages faster. There, a supplemental attachment. 1 line, 1 sentence, 1 phrase that made my pulse jump. Trust assets pledged as collateral documentation pending. I looked directly at Margaret. My father used trust property to secure debt. She folded her hands again. I am not yet in a position to answer that question. Not yet. Those 2 words echoed in my head because they meant there would come a moment when she could, and whatever prevented her from answering today was apparently only temporary. As I carefully returned the documents to the folder, Margaret reached into her briefcase and removed another sealed envelope. She placed it gently on the table between us. I believe, she said quietly, it's time you spoke with independent counsel before our next meeting. Stamped across the front of the envelope were 4 words that instantly erased every remaining doubt I had. Confidential pending beneficiary review. I didn't open the envelope in Margaret Collins' office. Every instinct I had as both an accountant and a professional told me the same thing. Never read potentially sensitive legal documents when you're emotionally overwhelmed. Margaret seemed to recognize my hesitation. Take your time. I don't think I'm processing any of this. That's understandable. She stood as our meeting came to an end. The purpose of today's meeting wasn't to alarm you. It worked anyway. I imagine it did. She offered a faint smile. But being surprised now is better than being surprised later. Before leaving, I asked one final question. Can I ask you something off the record? I can't answer off the record regarding trust matters. I figured. But you can ask. I hesitated. Should I be worried? Margaret looked directly into my eyes. As a trustee, I don't make decisions based on fear. Another careful answer. But as someone who's reviewed these records for many years, she paused. I believe beneficiaries deserve complete and accurate information before they make important decisions. Not reassuring, not frightening, simply honest. It was enough. When I reached my car, I placed the sealed envelope on the passenger seat instead of opening it immediately. I drove straight to my office. By then it was almost 4 p.m. My assistant Brooke looked up as I walked in. "Everything okay?" "I'll be in my office for the rest of the day." "No interruptions?" "No interruptions." She nodded without asking another question. Once the door was closed, I finally broke the seal. Inside were only 3 documents: a cover letter, a summary of beneficiary rights, and a recommendation that beneficiaries seek independent legal counsel before participating in future trust discussions involving secured obligations. That phrase stopped me. Secured obligations, not investments, not distributions, debt. There was also something else. Attached to the back of the letter was a short list titled Publicly Available Records Relevant to Simmons Family Trust. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a list of county filing numbers, mortgage records, commercial filings, Uniform Commercial Code financing statements. Everything Margaret had provided could be verified independently. She wasn't asking me to trust her. She was pointing me toward documents anyone could legally obtain. That told me something important. She expected the public record to support whatever was coming next. I opened my laptop. Within minutes, I was searching county databases. The first filing looked routine. Commercial loan, equipment financing. Nothing unusual. The second filing caught my attention. Collateral included construction equipment. Still normal? The third filing? I leaned closer to my screen. Among the listed collateral were several parcel identification numbers. I copied them into another database. Real estate ownership. The results appeared almost instantly. The properties weren't owned by Simmons Construction. They belonged to Simmons Family Trust. I read the page again, then a third time. The trust, not the company, owned those commercial lots. Yet they had been listed as collateral for business financing. That wasn't automatically illegal. Trust property can sometimes secure legitimate obligations if the governing document allows it and fiduciary requirements are satisfied. But the arrangement carries significant responsibility, especially when beneficiaries may be affected. I opened another filing, then another. By 6 o'clock, my whiteboard looked like a detective's wall. Loan dates, property addresses, recording numbers, renewal schedules, colored markers connected everything. One thing became obvious. The borrowing wasn't isolated. It had happened repeatedly. Every few years, another loan, another extension, another refinancing, always involving the same group of commercial properties, always connected somehow to Simmons Construction. I sat back. If this is what the public record shows, I whispered to myself, what's in the private files? My phone buzzed. Mom. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "Hi. Your father said you met with the trustee." "He did." "What happened?" "I can't discuss trust matters." She sounded surprised. "You won't tell your own mother." "I signed confidentiality paperwork." There was silence. Then she asked softly, "Is everything okay?" "I honestly don't know." She sighed. "Your father says Margaret is making everything more complicated than it needs to be." "Interesting." He blamed the trustee, not the documents. "What exactly is she complicating? I don't know." "Did Dad tell you?" "He just said lawyers always create problems." That sentence stayed with me after we hung up. Lawyers create problems. Except lawyers don't create debt. Lawyers document it. The next morning, I called Andrew Parker, I'd met Andrew years earlier through a bankruptcy restructuring case involving one of my clients. He was practical, never dramatic, exactly the kind of attorney I trusted. When I explained the situation, he interrupted only once. "You've confirmed the filings yourself?" "Yes." "Public records? Everyone? Good. When can we meet?" "This afternoon." His office overlooked the federal courthouse. After reviewing everything I'd printed, he organized the papers into neat stacks. He didn't speak for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, he leaned back. "So, what do you think?" "I think you're asking the wrong first question." "I am. You keep asking whether your father hid debt." I frowned. "Isn't that the issue?" "No." He slid one filing toward me. "The first question is whether he had authority." "Authority?" "To use trust assets the way these documents suggest." I hadn't thought of it that way. If the trust agreement permitted it, then we ask whether fiduciary duties were followed. And if they weren't, different conversation. He opened another file. "What concerns me more is timing." "Timing!" He pointed to several dates. "See these: loan renewal, extension, modification, renewal, extension, another modification." "They're clustered." "What does that mean?" "Usually, lenders restructure repeatedly only when the original repayment plan isn't working." "So cash flow problems." "Possibly." He circled another date. "This renewal happened only 5 weeks after another extension." "That's unusual." "Very." He looked at me. "In healthy companies, you generally don't renegotiate major loans every few weeks." My stomach tightened. So things were already unstable. They appear to have been. He wasn't making accusations. He was reading evidence, exactly as I would. Then he noticed something I'd completely overlooked. "This filing references another lender." I blinked. "It does." He handed me the page. Sure enough, a cross-reference number, completely different bank. I searched the reference online. Another secured filing appeared, then another, and another, different lenders, different years, same trust properties. The same assets had supported multiple financing arrangements over time. Andrew folded his arms. "This company has been refinancing for years. How many? We don't know yet, but enough that I'd like to see every filing." For the next 2 hours, we built a timeline across his conference room table. Loan after loan. Renewal after renewal. By evening, we had identified more than a dozen significant financing events over approximately 8 years. No wonder Margaret had looked so careful. This wasn't one bad decision. It looked like a long pattern. As I gathered the papers, Andrew asked quietly, "Has your father ever asked you to sign anything recently?" I thought about it. "No." "What about Ethan?" "I don't know." "If he has—" Andrew didn't finish. He didn't need to. Someone deeply involved in the company might have signed documents without fully understanding the financial picture. Driving home that night, I replayed everything. My father had spent months telling everyone I wanted his money. But if these records reflected reality, there might not be much money left to want. The thought wasn't satisfying. It was heartbreaking. Despite everything between us, Richard Simmons was still my father. I didn't want him ruined. I wanted the truth. The following Friday, an unexpected email landed in my inbox. The sender was Ethan. The subject line contained only 4 words. "Can we meet alone?" No explanation. No greeting. Just one attachment icon beneath the message. I clicked it. The file wouldn't open. It was password protected. Underneath, Ethan had typed a single sentence. "Dad can never know I sent this." I stared at Ethan's email for nearly a full minute before replying, where his response came less than 2 minutes later. "Saturday, 9 a.m., Maple and Maine coffee. Come alone. No small talk, no explanation. Just a place and a time. For years, Ethan and I had spoken only during holidays and birthdays. We were never openly hostile, but we had become strangers living inside the same family history. If he was asking to meet in secret, something significant had changed. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid. Maple and Maine sat a few miles from downtown Charlotte, tucked between an old bookstore and a florist. It wasn't the kind of place my father would ever visit. He preferred country clubs and private dining rooms. That was probably the point. I spotted Ethan sitting in the far corner with 2 untouched cups of coffee. He looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally. The confidence he usually carried had been replaced by something I had never seen on his face before. Uncertainty. As I sat down, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he slid 1 cup toward me. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure you really sent that email. I almost deleted it. What changed your mind? He looked out the window. I'm tired. Tired of what? He let out a slow breath. Feeling like something doesn't make sense. That wasn't the answer I expected. I had imagined anger, defensiveness, an argument. Instead, Ethan sounded defeated. I always believed Dad, he said quietly. I know. He told me you walked away because you didn't care about the family. I know. He said you thought you were better than us because you became a CPA. I smiled sadly. I never thought that. I believe you now. Those 4 words landed harder than any apology could have. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear them. He rubbed his forehead. You remember when you left the company? I remember. I thought you quit. I resigned. Dad told me you couldn't handle working with him. I looked at Ethan. Did you ever ask why I left? He hesitated. No. I wasn't allowed to make financial recommendations. You were 28. I was already a licensed CPA. I know. I found accounting mistakes. He frowned. What kind of mistakes? I never got the chance to explain. Back then, I had noticed inconsistent vendor payments and unusually aggressive revenue recognition. Nothing that proved fraud, but enough to justify asking questions. Richard Simmons didn't appreciate questions, especially from his daughter. When I brought up those issues, I said, Dad told me I didn't understand construction. Ethan looked genuinely confused. I never knew that. Of course you didn't. He said you wanted control. I wanted documentation. The difference mattered. A lot. For the next 20 minutes, we compared memories. It was unsettling how differently we'd experienced the same childhood. When Dad praised Ethan, I heard favoritism. When Dad criticized me, Ethan heard normal parenting. When I left the company, Ethan believed I was abandoning the family. When Ethan stayed, I assumed he agreed with everything Dad did. Neither of us had ever checked our assumptions. Richard had never needed to lie constantly. He only needed to tell each of us different versions of the same story. Eventually, Ethan reached into his messenger bag. I brought something. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. I don't even know if I should have these. What are they? Board packets. I frowned. I thought you said you weren't on the board. I'm not. So why do you have board packets? Dad asked me to sign acknowledgments after meetings. My stomach tightened. You signed documents for meetings you didn't attend. I thought that was normal. No. His face fell. It isn't. No. He slowly pushed the envelope toward me. I never really read them. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies. Corporate resolutions, consent forms, meeting summaries, loan approvals. Everything appeared ordinary at first glance, until I noticed something. Every packet contained only signature pages. The supporting financial schedules were missing. Ethan? Yeah? Where are the attachments? What attachments? The financial exhibits. He looked confused. I thought that's all there was. No. I flipped through another resolution. It approved refinancing, another authorized borrowing authority, another referenced financial statements. None of the financial statements were attached, only the pages requiring signatures. Ethan, I said carefully, did you ever ask to see the reports? He looked embarrassed. No. Why not? He's my father. That answer hurt more than it should have, because I understood it. Children don't naturally assume their parents are hiding information, especially adult children who have spent decades believing trust and obedience are the same thing. I continued reviewing the documents. One resolution referenced lender negotiations. Another approved revised borrowing limits. Another mentioned collateral adjustments. Every important detail appeared in an attachment that wasn't included. The signatures, however, those were complete. I looked at him. Did anyone explain these? Dad usually said something like, routine paperwork. The attorneys already reviewed it. And that was enough. He nodded slowly. I trusted him. Neither of us spoke for a while. The cafe buzzed quietly around us. Espresso machines, conversations, dishes clinking, normal Saturday sounds. Meanwhile, our family history was quietly being rewritten across the table. Finally, Ethan reached into the envelope one more time. There's something else. He removed a smaller folder. I almost didn't bring this. What is it? I found it in Dad's office last month. He handed it to me. Inside were photocopies of correspondence between Simmons Construction and 2 commercial lenders. Most of the letters discussed routine renewals. One letter stood apart. Its subject line read, Request for Temporary Covenant Waiver. I began reading. The company was asking the bank to temporarily waive certain financial requirements under an existing loan agreement. For anyone unfamiliar with commercial lending, the language would have looked technical. For me, it was alarming. Banks include financial promises called covenants in commercial loans. The borrower agrees to maintain certain financial ratios, provide accurate reporting, or avoid taking specific actions without approval. When a company asks for a covenant waiver, it usually means it has failed or expects to fail one of those promises. It doesn't automatically mean bankruptcy, but it often signals serious financial stress. I looked up. Where exactly did you find this? In Dad's desk. Was it hidden? It was inside a folder marked insurance. Interesting. Not locked. Just mislabeled, enough to avoid casual discovery. I continued reading. Near the bottom, one paragraph stood out. Additional collateral support may be required if future operating performance does not improve. Additional collateral, the phrase echoed in my head. How much collateral had already been pledged? I flipped to the next page. There was no next page, only a handwritten sticky note attached to the back. Dad's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Delay trustee discussion until refinancing closes. I froze. Ethan noticed. What? I handed him the note. His face lost color. I've never seen that. This is your father's handwriting. I know. The words themselves weren't proof of wrongdoing. Businesses often refinance. Trustees and lenders communicate all the time. But the timing bothered me. Why delay a discussion with the trustee? Why write it down? Why hide the document? Ethan leaned forward. Kaylee. Yeah. Can I ask you something? Of course. If the company was really struggling, he hesitated. Why would Dad spend months telling everyone you wanted his money? I answered before I even realized I had reached the conclusion. Because if everyone was watching me, they wouldn't be watching him, Ethan finished. Neither of us liked that answer, not because it sounded dramatic, because it made practical sense. Public attention is limited. If the family believed there was a conflict over inheritance, no one would be asking difficult questions about debt. Richard Simmons had spent decades understanding one simple truth. People rarely investigate the story they're emotionally invested in believing. Before leaving, Ethan looked at me carefully. I don't know if Dad broke the law. I don't know either. But I know he hasn't told us everything. I agree. He nodded once. If Margaret asks me questions, tell the truth. Even if it hurts him? I thought for a long moment before answering. It may be the only thing that helps him now. He didn't reply. Instead, he picked up his empty coffee cup and quietly said, I wish we'd had this conversation 10 years ago. So do I. We walked out separately. Halfway back to my office, my phone vibrated. It was a voicemail notification from Margaret Collins. Her message lasted less than 30 seconds. Ms. Simmons, I've received additional documentation from one of the Trust's lending institutions. Based on that information, I'm formally advancing next week's beneficiary meeting. Attendance by all beneficiaries is now mandatory. She paused, then added one sentence that immediately made my pulse quicken. I strongly recommend bringing your legal counsel. By Monday morning, Andrew Parker had already listened to Margaret Collins' voicemail twice. He placed his phone on the conference table and looked at me without saying a word. Finally, he broke this silence. Trustees don't move meetings forward unless something changes. You think she found something? I think she confirmed something. There was an important difference. Suspicions can wait. Confirmed facts cannot. He opened a legal pad. Let's organize what we actually know. I appreciated that approach. The past few weeks had been emotionally exhausting, and emotions have a way of filling gaps with assumptions. Facts don't. Andrew wrote 3 headings across the top of the page. Verified, likely, unknown. Verified. I began listing them. The trust owns multiple commercial properties. He wrote it down. Those properties have been pledged as collateral. Another note. Repeated refinancing over approximately 8 years. He nodded. Public filings confirm that. What else? Ethan signed corporate acknowledgments without receiving complete financial exhibits. Andrew paused. Careful. I looked at him. That's verified only to the extent Ethan says that's what happened. Fair point. He moved that point into the likely column. Then he pointed to the last heading. Unknown. I answered immediately. We still don't know whether Richard had authority. Correct. We don't know whether the trustee approved every transaction. Correct. We don't know whether beneficiaries were legally entitled to disclosures earlier. Exactly. The exercise calmed me. It reminded me why I loved accounting. Numbers don't eliminate uncertainty. They reduce it. Around noon, Ethan arrived. He looked even more exhausted than he had at the coffee shop. I didn't sleep. Andrew offered him a seat. You don't need to prove anything today. I'm not here to prove anything. Ethan placed another folder on the table. I'm here because I found more. I looked at him. What is it? My office storage cabinet. You've been looking, I couldn't stop. Inside the folder were dozens of copies, board resolutions, internal memoranda, meeting agendas. Unlike the first batch, these included supporting schedules. Andrew immediately began sorting everything chronologically. I focused on the financial attachments. Within 15 minutes, another pattern emerged. Every major borrowing decision contained nearly identical language. Approved subject to temporary cash flow stabilization. Temporary. Again, and again, and again. 8 years of temporary solutions. Nothing temporary lasts that long. I kept reading. Revenue projections, expense reductions, equipment sales, bridge financing. Every plan assumed the following year would solve the previous year's problems. None of them had. Then one spreadsheet stopped me. Projected cash flow, actual cash flow. The difference wasn't small. In several years, actual operating cash had fallen millions below projections. I looked at Ethan. Did you ever see these reports? He shook his head immediately. No. Who prepared them? Our controller. Did Dad review them? Every month. So he knew. I guess. Andrew leaned forward. Don't guess. Ethan corrected himself. Yes. There was sadness in his voice now. Not anger. Acceptance. He had spent years believing he was being trained to run a successful business. Instead, he was discovering he had mostly been shielded from reality. As we continued reviewing documents, something unexpected happened. I found my own name. Not once. Several times. Minutes from internal planning meetings. One paragraph read, potential concern regarding Kaylee Simmons' financial expertise if she becomes involved. I frowned. There was another note beneath it. Maintain communication through Richard. Then another. Avoid unnecessary disclosure unless required. I looked at Andrew. This isn't normal. No. It sounds like they were discussing me. They were. But why? Andrew didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped ahead several pages. There it was. Another internal memo. This one wasn't addressed to the board. It appeared to be prepared for Richard before a meeting with outside advisors. One sentence had been highlighted. Kaylee Simmons possesses restructuring experience that may materially affect negotiations if independent review is requested. I read it twice, then a third time. They hadn't underestimated me. They had anticipated me. My father knew exactly what I did for a living. He also knew that if I ever reviewed the company's finances independently, I might ask questions no one else would think to ask. Suddenly, the rumors about me chasing his money made a different kind of sense. If people believed I wanted an inheritance, then every question I asked could be dismissed as greed. Not professional judgment. Greed. I leaned back in my chair. My reputation wasn't collateral damage. Andrew looked at me. It may have been part of the strategy. No one spoke for several moments. Because that possibility hurt more than the financial deception, debt can be repaid, trust is harder. Ethan finally whispered. He used me too. I looked at him. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was stating a fact. He had been praised for loyalty while being kept uninformed. I had been discredited before I ever spoke. Richard had managed to isolate both of us in different ways. The phone on Andrew's desk rang. His assistant stepped inside. Margaret Collins is here. I frowned. Here? Andrew looked equally surprised. I wasn't expecting her. Margaret entered carrying 2 locked document cases. I apologize for arriving unannounced. No apology necessary, Andrew said. What happened? She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she placed both cases carefully on the conference table. I received authorization this morning to disclose additional information to the beneficiaries. What changed? I asked. The lending institution. She unlocked the first case. Inside were neatly organized binders. I've spent the weekend verifying documents. Andrew asked the question everyone was thinking. Did you find evidence of fraud? Margaret answered without hesitation. I did not. That answer relieved me more than I expected. But, she continued, I found evidence of incomplete disclosure. Andrew nodded slowly. To the beneficiaries? Yes. She opened the first binder. As trustee, I am obligated to notify beneficiaries when material information affects the trust. She placed a chart in front of us. It wasn't complicated, just a timeline. On the left were trust assets. Across the top were years. Beneath each year appeared colored markers: green, yellow, orange, then red. What am I looking at? Ethan asked. Margaret answered in plain English. This chart tracks the percentage of trust assets exposed to secured business obligations. She pointed to the earliest year. Initially, less than 15% of trust assets supported commercial borrowing. She moved to the next years. Then 23%. 31. 42. 58. My breathing slowed. By the final year, nearly 70% of the trust's major assets had at one point or another been tied to obligations connected to Simmons' construction. No wonder she wanted independent counsel present. This wasn't merely a struggling business. It was a trust whose exposure had grown dramatically over nearly a decade. Ethan looked physically ill. I thought we owned everything free and clear. Margaret spoke gently. Ownership and debt exposure are not the same. She turned another page. This is the independent audit I commissioned after repeated reporting delays. Andrew began reading immediately. His expression changed almost at once. He slid the report toward me without saying a word. Across the top of the executive summary, one sentence had been boxed by the auditors. Material liabilities were not consistently reflected in beneficiary communications during multiple reporting periods. I looked up. So, my father wasn't hiding one bad year. Margaret met my eyes. No. He was hiding a pattern. She nodded once. That is the conclusion supported by the independent review. The room became completely silent. Then Margaret reached into the second locked case. She removed one final sealed folder. Unlike every document we'd seen so far, this one carried a bright red label, Confidential, Beneficiary Meeting Exhibit. She looked first at Andrew, then at Ethan, finally at me. The contents of this folder, she said quietly, will be presented to the entire Simmons family tomorrow morning. I glanced at the seal. What is it? Margaret's voice remained steady. It is the first document that directly explains why Mr. Richard Simmons spent months convincing everyone that you were only interested in his money. I barely slept the night before the beneficiary meeting, not because I was afraid of what Margaret Collins might reveal, because I had reached the point where almost any answer felt possible. For 3 months, my father had turned relatives against me. For weeks, I had uncovered refinancing records, loan renewals, covenant waivers, and trustee correspondence. Yesterday, Margaret had confirmed what none of us wanted to believe. The debt wasn't a rumor. It was a documented pattern. But she still hadn't answered the question that haunted me. Why? Why destroy your own daughter's reputation? Why not simply tell the truth? At 9 o'clock the next morning, Andrew and I walked into Collins Fiduciary Services together. This time, the conference room looked different. A court reporter sat near one wall. A digital recorder rested in the center of the table. Each seat held an identical binder. Every binder had a numbered tab. Everything about the room suggested that today's meeting would become part of an official record. Richard Simmons was already there. He wore the same confident navy suit he always chose for business meetings. From a distance, he looked exactly like the successful businessman people admired. Only when I looked closer did I notice small changes. His tie wasn't perfectly straight. There were dark circles beneath his eyes. His right hand rested on the table just a little too tightly. Patricia sat beside him, twisting her wedding ring. Ethan quietly took the chair across from me. No one smiled. Margaret entered precisely at 9. "Good morning." Her voice carried the same calm professionalism as always. "As trustee of the Simmons Family Trust, I am calling this beneficiary meeting to order." She waited until everyone settled. "The purpose of today's meeting is not to assign blame." My father nodded slightly, almost relieved. "It is to fulfill my fiduciary obligation to provide complete and accurate information to all beneficiaries." Richard's expression changed, only slightly. "But I noticed," Margaret continued. "Over the past several weeks, questions have arisen regarding trust assets, secured obligations, and beneficiary disclosures." She opened her binder. "An independent review has now been completed." She looked around the room. "I will summarize the findings in plain language." I appreciated that. Legal jargon helps lawyers. Families need clarity. Margaret projected the first slide onto the screen. It wasn't dramatic, just a timeline. She walked us through it year by year. 8 years ago, Simmons Construction experienced declining operating cash flow. Richard shifted in his chair. "Commercial borrowing increased." Next slide. "The company refinanced existing obligations." Another slide. "Additional collateral was requested." Then another. "Certain trust-owned properties were pledged to support commercial financing." She paused. "That decision was legally documented." I looked toward Andrew. He gave the smallest possible nod. So far, nothing she had said suggested fraud, only increasing financial pressure. Margaret continued. "Subsequent refinancing occurred on multiple occasions." The timeline filled with dates. Renewal, extension, modification, renewal, another modification, again and again. Looking at them together was more powerful than seeing individual documents. It wasn't one emergency. It was a business surviving one extension at a time. Patricia whispered softly, "I didn't know." Richard didn't respond. Margaret turned another page. "Now we reach the issue that directly affects every beneficiary." She looked toward me, then toward Ethan. "As trustee, I requested updated financial reporting repeatedly." A chart appeared. Request. Reminder. Second request. Late submission. Request. Reminder. Late submission. The pattern repeated for years. I initially believed these delays reflected administrative problems. She took a slow breath. The independent review established a different conclusion. No one moved. The delays prevented beneficiaries from receiving complete information regarding the trust's financial exposure. Andrew quietly wrote something in his notebook. Richard finally spoke. "Margaret." She looked at him. "I don't think this characterization is fair." She answered calmly. "The findings are supported by documented correspondence. You don't understand construction financing." "My responsibility isn't construction financing." She didn't raise her voice. "It's beneficiary disclosure." The room became silent again. Richard leaned back. "I was protecting my family." Margaret replied immediately. "I understand that was your stated intention." Stated intention, not established fact. She never argued. She simply distinguished between explanation and evidence. Then she opened the red folder labeled Exhibit A. "This exhibit contains communications not previously provided to beneficiaries." She distributed copies. I looked down. Emails, letters, internal memoranda. Nothing appeared shocking at first, until I reached the third page. An email from one of the company's outside financial advisors. Subject: beneficiary communication strategy. My pulse quickened. Richard stared at the table. Margaret spoke. "This communication was recovered during the independent review." She allowed everyone several moments to read. The advisor's email discussed upcoming refinancing negotiations. One paragraph had been highlighted. Additional beneficiary scrutiny may complicate lender discussions if financial exposure becomes widely known before restructuring is finalized. I frowned. Then I continued reading. The advisor suggested several communication options. One recommendation immediately stood out. Maintain focus on anticipated succession issues rather than current debt structure. I looked up. What does that mean? Margaret answered carefully. It means discussions about inheritance were considered less damaging than discussions about debt. Nobody spoke, not even Richard. Ethan slowly turned another page. There it was. Meeting notes, prepared after the advisor's email. One handwritten sentence appeared beside the agenda. Richard will handle family communications personally. My father finally looked at Margaret. That's being taken out of context. She remained composed. Please explain the context. I wanted to avoid unnecessary panic. Andrew spoke for the first time. Among beneficiaries. Richard looked irritated. Among everyone. Margaret nodded politely. The next exhibit addresses that. She placed another document on the table. Telephone logs, family meeting notes, lists of relatives contacted, dates, names, comments. Everything organized chronologically. She summarized the findings. Over approximately 11 weeks, Mr. Simmons personally contacted multiple relatives regarding anticipated inheritance concerns. Patricia stared at her husband. You called everyone? He didn't answer. Margaret continued. During that same period, no comparable communications disclosed the trust's increasing secured obligations. I finally understood. The rumors weren't accidental. They weren't emotional outbursts. They had been organized. Maybe not maliciously, but deliberately. My father hadn't simply complained about me. He had carefully directed everyone's attention toward a story that kept them from asking different questions. Richard rubbed his forehead. I never said Kaylee stole anything. No, Margaret replied. You repeatedly suggested she was motivated primarily by inheritance. I believed that. The words hung in the room. He believed that, or he needed everyone else to. Margaret calmly asked, what evidence supported that belief? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. No answer came. Because there wasn't one. I had never requested trust distributions, never asked for estate planning documents, never questioned his will, never sought company ownership. Everything I had asked about involved financial transparency. Margaret looked toward me. Ms. Simmons, according to our records, you requested no distributions, no accelerated inheritance, and no beneficiary advances. That's correct. She nodded once. The documentation supports your statement. She turned back to Richard. There is no evidence that Ms. Simmons attempted to obtain trust assets. Silence. For the first time in months. It wasn't my word against my father's. It was documented fact. Patricia slowly lowered her eyes. I told people. Her voice cracked. I repeated what Richard told me. She looked at me. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say, because hearing those words didn't erase what had happened, but they mattered. Ethan finally spoke. Dad, Richard looked at him. Did you know the company was already this deep in debt when you told everyone Kaylee wanted your money? My father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the documents scattered across the table. The confident businessman who had controlled every family conversation for decades suddenly looked very old. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. I couldn't let people think the company was failing. No one interrupted. I spent 40 years building Simmons Construction. His hands trembled slightly. If word got around that lenders were nervous, He stopped. Clients would have panicked. Andrew asked quietly, "So you redirected the conversation." Richard closed his eyes. "I thought if everyone believed the family was arguing about inheritance." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. We all understood. No one would be asking about debt. Margaret closed the binder. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Simmons." Then she looked at every beneficiary in the room. "However, there is one additional matter that has not yet been addressed." She reached beneath the conference table and lifted another document case. Unlike every previous exhibit, this one bore the seal of a commercial bank. Andrew immediately straightened in his chair. Margaret rested the case on the table. "The documents inside were delivered to me 48 hours ago by one of the Trust's primary lending institutions." She unlocked the case, removed a single envelope, then looked directly at Richard. "I believe," she said quietly, "this is the first time your family is about to learn the actual amount of debt you personally guaranteed." Fan 8. No one reached for the envelope, not even Margaret. For several seconds, every person in the room simply stared at it. The seal from First Carolina Commercial Bank suddenly felt heavier than every binder we had reviewed that morning. Richard finally broke the silence. "You don't have to do this." Margaret looked at him calmly. "I do." "You've already explained the situation." "I've explained part of it." She rested both hands on the table. "My fiduciary responsibility requires complete disclosure." Richard's shoulders sank. Andrew quietly leaned toward me. "This is probably what accelerated the meeting." I nodded. The bank hadn't merely sent documents. It had changed the trustee's obligations. Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a certified packet with several exhibits. She removed the first page. "This document was provided directly by First Carolina Commercial Bank in response to the trustee's formal request for verification." She looked around the room. "It confirms the current status of obligations connected to trust assets." Then she read the opening paragraph. "As of the verification date, outstanding obligations secured directly or indirectly by trust-supported collateral total." She stopped reading long enough for everyone to follow the figure printed beneath it. I felt my stomach tighten. The amount wasn't just large. It was far beyond anything I had imagined. Even after years of reviewing distressed businesses, seeing the actual number attached to my own family's trust hit differently. Patricia covered her mouth. Ethan stared without blinking. Richard lowered his eyes. Margaret continued. "For clarity, this does not mean the trust owes this amount." She deliberately spoke in plain English. "It means trust-owned assets have been exposed to obligations of approximately this value through pledged collateral and related guarantees," Andrew added quietly for everyone's benefit. "If the borrower defaults, lenders may seek recovery from collateral to the extent allowed by the governing agreements." Patricia looked confused. "So," she turned toward Margaret, "the trust wasn't full of money." Margaret answered gently. "The trust still owns valuable assets." She paused. "But ownership and available value are not the same when those assets support substantial debt." Patricia leaned back in her chair as if someone had taken the air out of her lungs. "I spent years believing." She couldn't finish. Neither could Ethan. He looked at our father. "You told me the company was stronger than ever." Richard rubbed both hands together. "It should have been. That's not what I asked. I believed we'd recover." "When—" No answer. Margaret turned another page. "The bank also provided copies of personal guarantee agreements." Andrew immediately focused. "I did too. Corporate loans often require someone, usually the owner, to personally guarantee repayment. That means if the company can't pay, the lender can pursue that individual under the terms of the guarantee." Margaret held up the document. This guarantee bears Mr. Richard Simmons' signature." She laid it flat. It was renewed multiple times. She placed another beside it. And again, then another, and again. The stack continued to grow, year after year, renewal after renewal. Richard had repeatedly placed his own financial future behind the company's obligations. Suddenly, his decisions looked less like reckless gambling and more like desperation. Dangerous desperation. Ethan quietly asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" Richard looked at him. "What would you have done? We could have helped." "With what?" His voice cracked. "More opinions." For the first time that day, I didn't hear arrogance. I heard exhaustion. "I thought every new project would fix it." He stared at the table. "Every contract looked like the one that would finally turn things around." He laughed bitterly. "It never did." Margaret let him speak. She wasn't there to embarrass him. She was there to establish facts. When Richard finished, she continued, "There is one remaining issue." She opened another section of the packet. "The trustee repeatedly requested complete disclosure to beneficiaries." She placed several letters side by side, one after another. Every letter carried the same theme: request for updated financial information, request for clarification, request for beneficiary disclosure. Some had been answered, others had not. A few contained handwritten notes from Richard asking for additional time. Nothing illegal about asking for time, but together they painted a picture of a man postponing difficult conversations for years. Andrew spoke carefully. "Margaret, were beneficiaries ever formally informed of the increasing financial exposure before now?" "No." "Were they entitled to that information?" "Under the terms of this trust." She looked directly at each of us. "Yes." The room fell silent again. That answer mattered, not because it automatically created legal liability, because it established something simpler. We should have known. Patricia wiped away tears. "I kept defending you." She looked at Richard. "I told everyone Kaylee misunderstood you." Then she turned toward me. "I told people you were overreacting." I reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "I'm not angry that you believed him." She looked at me. "I'm angry that none of us were given the truth." She nodded slowly. "I wasn't protecting the family." She whispered the words almost to herself. "I was protecting a story." Those words stayed with me. For years, our family hadn't been built on honesty. It had been built on a version of reality carefully maintained by one person, and everyone else had unknowingly helped preserve it. Ethan cleared his throat. "Dad." Richard looked up. "If Kaylee hadn't come," he stopped. "If Margaret hadn't forced this meeting," another pause, "how much longer would you have kept pretending?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window overlooking downtown Charlotte. Finally, he said, "I don't know." It was probably the most honest sentence he'd spoken all morning. Margaret closed the bank packet. "I want to make one point absolutely clear." Everyone looked at her. "Financial failure is not a moral failure." She allowed those words to settle. "Businesses fail. Markets change. Projects go wrong." She looked directly at Richard. "What destroys families is not debt." She paused. "It's secrecy." No one disagreed. Then she continued. The independent audit reached one additional conclusion. Andrew raised his head. "There is no evidence that Ms. Kaylee Simmons attempted to obtain improper financial benefit from the trust." She looked at me. "The audit also found no evidence that she influenced company borrowing trust administration or beneficiary reporting." Andrew smiled for the first time that day. "That's important." Margaret nodded. It restores the factual record. For 3 months, my reputation had been quietly dismantled. One sentence grounded in evidence restored what rumors never should have taken. Not perfectly, not instantly, but officially. Richard slowly turned toward me. I owe you an apology. The room froze. I had imagined that moment many times. In every version, I thought it would feel satisfying. It didn't. It felt sad, because apologies don't return lost trust. They acknowledge its absence. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I convinced myself that if people questioned your motives, he swallowed, they wouldn't question mine. I didn't answer immediately, not because I wanted to punish him, because I needed to know something. So tell me the truth now. He looked directly at me. What truth? Why did you never ask me for help? His eyes filled with tears. You were the one person I knew would see through every number. That answer hurt more than every accusation, because buried inside it was an unexpected compliment. He hadn't pushed me away because I lacked ability. He had pushed me away because he knew I had too much of it. Andrew quietly gathered his papers. Margaret began organizing the exhibits. The formal meeting was ending. I assumed everything important had already been revealed. Then Margaret paused. There is one administrative matter remaining. She reached into her briefcase and removed a prepared legal document. Its title immediately caught my attention. Emergency Resolution Regarding Future Trust Administration. She looked directly at every beneficiary. This resolution determines who will have authority over future financial decisions involving the Simmons Family Trust. No one spoke as Margaret Collins placed the resolution in the center of the conference table. The title alone changed the atmosphere. Emergency Resolution Regarding Future Trust Administration. For the first time that morning, the conversation shifted away from the past. This was about the future. Margaret adjusted her glasses before speaking. The trust cannot continue operating under the same procedures that allowed incomplete beneficiary disclosures. She looked first at Richard, then at Ethan, finally at me. My responsibility is not only to explain what happened, it is also to prevent it from happening again. Andrew gave a small nod. That is consistent with a trustee's fiduciary obligations. Margaret opened the resolution. I'll summarize the proposed changes before asking for comments. She read each provision slowly, making sure everyone understood. First, no trust-owned asset may be pledged as collateral for any future business obligation without written notice to every beneficiary and formal trustee approval. She looked toward Patricia. In plain language, no one can quietly put trust property at risk again. Patricia nodded immediately. Good. Second, quarterly financial reporting prepared by an independent accounting firm will be distributed directly to every beneficiary. Not through Richard, not through the company, directly. As an accountant, I almost smiled. Transparency wasn't glamorous, but it prevented misunderstandings before they became disasters. Third, any proposed transaction involving more than 5% of total trust assets must receive legal review independent of company management. Andrew quietly whispered, That's smart. Margaret continued, Fourth, the trust will no longer guarantee new commercial borrowing for Simmons Construction. That sentence changed everything. Richard closed his eyes. Without trust assets supporting future loans, the company would have to survive on its own financial strength. Or it wouldn't survive at all. He understood exactly what that meant. Margaret placed the resolution down. Questions? Richard raised his hand slightly. If the trust won't support future financing, my company may not qualify for additional credit, Margaret answered honestly. That is possible. You know what this could do. I do. Silence settled over the room again. Finally, Richard looked at me. Not Margaret, not Andrew, me. "What would you do?" It was the first time in years my father had asked for my professional opinion instead of dismissing it. I didn't answer immediately. I opened the financial summaries one more time, then the audit, then the debt schedules. Only after reviewing the numbers again did I speak. "The company has a future." Richard looked surprised. "It does. Yes." Hope briefly returned to his face. Then I continued. "But not the version you've been trying to preserve." His expression changed again. "You've been refinancing to protect the size of the business." I pointed to the reports, instead of asking what size the business could actually support. Andrew leaned back, allowing me to continue. "You're carrying equipment you rarely use." I turned another page. "Maintaining regional offices that no longer generate enough work." Another page. "And bidding on projects with margins too thin to recover past losses." Richard didn't interrupt. Neither did Ethan. For years, my father had never allowed me to finish a financial recommendation. Today, he listened. "If you want my opinion, I do. You stop pretending the company is still what it was 10 years ago." He looked down. "You sell underperforming assets." I pointed to another schedule. "Reduce debt instead of extending it." Another page. "Focus on profitable contracts instead of chasing revenue." Ethan slowly nodded. "I've been saying some of that internally." Richard looked at him in surprise. "You never said it like this." "I never thought you'd listen." That sentence hurt all of us. Not because of what Ethan said, because it was believable. Richard had spent years surrounding himself with people who reassured him, not people who challenged him. Margaret waited until the room became quiet again. "Mr. Simmons." He looked up. "The trustee has one additional recommendation." "I'm listening." "Future restructuring discussions should occur under independent financial supervision." He frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means major financial decisions should be reviewed by someone with no personal interest in preserving appearances." Andrew smiled slightly. "I can think of one CPA qualified for that." Every head turned toward me. I almost laughed. 3 months earlier, I had supposedly been chasing my father's money. Now the trustee was suggesting I supervise the financial restructuring that might save what remained of the family business. Life has an unusual sense of irony. Richard looked at me. "I don't deserve to ask." "No, I know. But I'm asking anyway." He swallowed. "Will you help us?" There it was. The question I'd imagined ever since this nightmare began. Months earlier, I would have answered from emotion. Today, I answered like a professional. "I'll help the company." Hope appeared in Ethan's eyes. "But," Richard nodded slowly. "I knew there'd be a but. I won't help you hide anything. I understand. I won't sign misleading reports. I understand. I won't participate in blaming anyone else if difficult decisions upset people." Another nod. "I understand. I won't communicate through family gossip." Patricia quietly smiled. "Good. I communicate through meetings, written reports, and documented decisions." Richard nodded again. "I understand. And one more condition." He looked at me carefully. "If I discover something that legally or ethically requires disclosure," I held his gaze, "I disclose it. Even if it embarrassed him, even if lenders saw it, even if relatives learned the truth." He didn't answer immediately. This was the hardest condition, because it required surrendering control over the narrative he had managed for years. Finally, he spoke. "I accept." Andrew looked at him. "You understand this will all be documented." "I know." "You won't be able to change your mind next month." "I know." Margaret handed Andrew a draft engagement agreement. "I prepared this in anticipation of today's discussion." Andrew reviewed it carefully. Everything was straightforward. Independent advisory services, no management authority, no authority to bind the trust, only professional recommendations, exactly as it should be. I signed first. Andrew signed next. Richard held the pen for several seconds before adding his own signature. As he slid the document back across the table, he looked at me. I spent months trying to convince everyone you wanted my money. I waited. You never wanted my money. No. You wanted the truth. Yes. And I made those two things sound like they were the same. I nodded. You did. He lowered his head. I'm ashamed of that. No one rushed to comfort him, not because we lacked compassion, because accountability deserves space. Margaret collected the signed agreement and placed it inside the trust file. This concludes the administrative portion of today's meeting. Everyone began gathering papers. I thought we were finished. Then Margaret looked toward Richard one last time. There is one final matter. He looked tired. What now? The bank has already agreed to postpone further action pending the restructuring proposal. Richard let out a breath of relief. But there was always a but. They've requested the first independent financial review within 30 days. 30 days. Not 6 months. Not next year. 30 days to prove the company could survive honestly. As we left the conference room, Ethan walked beside me in silence. Just before reaching the elevator, he finally spoke. You know, what? I think today was the first real board meeting this company has ever had. I smiled. I think you're right. The elevator doors opened. Before either of us stepped inside, my phone vibrated. It was a text message from an unknown number. There was no greeting, only one sentence. Your grandfather tried to stop this years ago. I think you should know why. I read the anonymous text message twice before showing it to Andrew. He looked at the number, frowned, and handed my phone back. Don't respond. You don't think it's legitimate. I think we don't know. He glanced toward the courthouse across the street. If someone has information, they can provide it through proper channels. That was exactly what I would have told one of my own clients. Still, the message stayed with me. Your grandfather tried to stop this years ago. Over the next few days, I learned where it had come from. Not through another mysterious text, through paperwork. Margaret called me the following week. We've finished organizing your grandfather's original trust files. Did you find something? I found a letter from my grandfather. Yes, it wasn't hidden. It was simply never relevant until now. When I arrived at her office, she handed me a copy instead of the original. It was addressed to future trustees, not to beneficiaries, not to my father, to whoever would someday oversee the trust. The letter had been written nearly 20 years earlier. My grandfather explained why he had created the Simmons Family Trust. He wasn't trying to build a family fortune. He was trying to protect the family from making emotional decisions during difficult financial times. One paragraph stopped me. If my children or grandchildren ever feel pressured to choose between protecting the truth and protecting my reputation, I hope they choose the truth. Businesses can recover from honest mistakes. Families rarely recover from carefully maintained lies. I lowered the page. Margaret smiled gently. I thought you should read that before we closed the administration review. So Grandpa worried this might happen. He understood human nature. That felt different. Less like a prediction, more like wisdom earned through experience. 6 months passed faster than I expected. The restructuring wasn't easy. It wasn't glamorous. And it certainly wasn't painless. Simmons Construction sold 2 underused equipment yards. 3 executive vehicles were auctioned. The company closed a regional office that had been losing money for years. Several projects with almost no profit margin were declined. Richard hated every one of those decisions, but for the first time he didn't overrule them. Every recommendation was discussed in documented meetings. Every financial report went directly to all beneficiaries. Every quarter, an independent accounting firm verified the numbers before anyone else saw them. There were no surprises, no hidden refinancing, no unexplained extensions, just facts. The first few months were difficult, revenue fell, the company became smaller. Some people in town whispered that Simmons Construction was failing. Oddly enough, Richard no longer tried to silence them. One afternoon, he walked into my office carrying 2 coffees. Something he had never done before. I figured you probably hadn't taken a break. I accepted the cup. Thanks. He looked around my office. I've never actually seen where you work. I noticed. He laughed softly. I deserved that. We sat quietly for a moment. Finally, he spoke. I read Dad's letter. So did I. He was wiser than I realized. He usually was. Richard stared out my office window. You know what scares me the most. What? I spent so many years trying to look successful that I stopped asking whether I was making good decisions. I didn't argue, because he wasn't asking for reassurance. He was admitting something to himself. I thought if people lost confidence in me, he shook his head, everything would collapse. And did it? No. What collapsed? He smiled sadly. The version of me I wanted everyone to believe. There was honesty in that answer. More honesty than I'd heard from him in years. The business survived. Smaller, healthier, far less impressive from the outside, much stronger on the inside. Ethan grew into a very different leader than our father. He asked questions. He encouraged disagreement. Every major financial meeting ended the same way. What concerns haven't we discussed yet? It became part of the company culture. I was proud of that. Patricia changed too. She began calling me every Thursday evening, not because she needed something, not because there was another family crisis, simply to talk. One night, she quietly admitted something. I spent years believing keeping peace meant avoiding difficult conversations. I smiled. I used to believe that too. I was wrong. So was I. Neither of us tried to erase the past. We simply stopped pretending it hadn't happened. As for the trust, Margaret officially presented her final administration report at the end of the 6th month. Every beneficiary received the same binder, every schedule, every audit, every recommendation. Nothing filtered, nothing summarized differently for different people. When the meeting ended, Margaret closed the file and looked at all of us. The Simmons Family Trust is no longer pledged to support future commercial borrowing. She smiled. All reporting obligations have been brought into compliance. Andrew shook her hand. Congratulations, she laughed softly. Trustees rarely receive congratulations. You earned this one. Then she turned toward me. Ms. Simmons. Yes, there's one statement I'd like entered into the final record. I nodded. She read from the closing report. The independent review found no evidence that beneficiary Kaylee Simmons sought improper financial gain, attempted to influence trust administration for personal benefit, or acted contrary to the interests of the trust. For months, people had whispered that I wanted my father's money. Now the official record said something very different. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was the truth. After everyone left, Richard asked whether we could walk outside together. We stood on the sidewalk in the late afternoon sun. Charlotte bustled around us. For the first time in years, there was nothing urgent to solve. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were, he said. They can't. I know. I don't think they should. He nodded slowly. I spent a long time believing forgiveness meant getting everything back. I looked at him. It doesn't. What does it mean? It means I'm willing to stop carrying the anger. I took a slow breath. But it doesn't mean I stop having boundaries. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. You were. I finally understand the difference. We never became the perfect family. Holiday dinners remained a little awkward. Some conversations still carried old scars, but they were honest scars, not hidden ones. People often ask me whether I regret uncovering everything, whether life would have been easier if I had ignored the rumors and stayed silent. The answer is always the same. Silence would have protected my father's image for a little longer. It would not have protected my family. Truth came with embarrassment, with smaller bank accounts, with difficult conversations. But it also came with something we hadn't had in years. Trust. Real trust. Not the kind built on reputation, the kind built on transparency. And that turned out to be worth far more than the inheritance everyone thought they were fighting over. Some family wounds don't begin with cruelty. They begin with fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, or fear of losing the identity we've spent a lifetime building. When that fear turns into secrecy, the people closest to us often pay the highest price. If you've ever been blamed for asking reasonable questions or made to feel guilty for wanting honesty, remember that healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. Asking for transparency does not make you selfish. Protecting your reputation with facts is not the same as attacking someone else's. And forgiveness, when it comes, doesn't require you to hand back unlimited access to your life. It simply allows you to move forward without letting someone else's choices define your future. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where telling the truth was mistaken for disloyalty? Share your experience in the comments, because your story may help someone else feel less alone. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about family accountability, justice, and healing, consider subscribing for more. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.